But one thing that I like, and I don't know, get your opinion on it. One thing that we all enjoy is using the books to be able to introduce new elements, and it's not always about the characters themselves. It's about kind of taking a little bit of narrative control in some way. They come across a guy, he's a knight, and someone writes a book. The knight kills someone. It's a book. And it's like, those are fun sometimes.
Sure. But those are different from what we're talking about. Those are situation. Okay. I've got jargon for this.
Okay.
And the words that you've run across before, I think, in terms of my use of the word authorities, which is actually, some people hate that word. So I don't even know if it's the right word. But I like it. But to a lot of people, it connotes a hierarchy. Somebody's being told what to do, so that upsets them. I don't know. But I'm talking about authority over fictional content. And there's backstory authority, right? Who would say, what is this knight's backstory? Where did they come into it before? Where have they been? What have they done? What are they like before we meet them? Right up until that point, what is going on with this guy? That's backstory authority. Then there's situational authority, which is the knight kills someone. Right? This is a situation. The knight has done this thing. It's happening right here in play. We're in the middle of it. Saying you're in the tavern. That's situational authority. It doesn't have to be a crisis. But just anything that says what's going on, and in particular, where are your characters relative to this? That's situational authority. Notice that in all these cases, there are mechanisms by which authority can be shared and components of it can be brought together from different people. That's okay. I'm not saying anything about single person right now. That's a rules option for each of these authorities, right? Another one, which is the one that I think is the most important for you, is outcome authority. And there are games in which outcome authority is explicitly aesthetic. Somebody's going to have an aesthetic power over how it turns out. Whereas other games say, no, you don't. You are going to look at what happens with these procedures that we've got, and those procedures are going to be very authoritative. I mean, we are going to conduct these procedures and use them as constraints on outcomes. And then you have narration authority, which confuses everybody because they think that's just part of outcome authority. It's not. Stating how something finishes, describing it. It can be trivial, just like making a sound effect, but very fun. Or it can be very substantive. And given that, the princess falls in love with you instead. Right? So the description of how it turns out is a remarkably powerful piece of play. And often what's stated as trivial during those moments can turn into substantial content later. In fact, that's very common. So these are four completely different things. And regardless of how any one of them is handled, whether it's handled with or without mechanical constraints, whether it's handled by group input in different ways, or whether one person's got it, period, for that level of authority, they are all independent of one another. However this one's parsed doesn't mean anything about however that one's parsed. So, in your game, I think you've seen, I hope I've made it clear that sometimes you are hitting a particularly situational authority, you're hitting it from different directions, which is okay. But what we need to avoid is diverse ways to set up a situation that can clash in practice as procedure. If whether this guy catches you is dependent on a roll, then that's very different as an outcome. Well, what if, you see how that could be very confusing to somebody who had said, one of my enemies catches up with me, captures me, as a concession. How did we get there? Did we get him catching him? Me, my guy, he's caught because we've said so in the concession as we set this up? Or did we roll? In other words, if I set it as a concession, there shouldn't be a roll. Do you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Under ordinary circumstances where there's no concession in play about this and this guy's running to chase me, we're going to roll it off, right? It's going to be havoc.
Right.
But if in the beginning of this whole situation I wrote a book saying one of my enemies catches me, and then at this moment in play I had said, oh, by the way, Jeff, now's the time. Now's when he catches me. I'm taking the concession. So those are two different mechanics, aren't they?
Right.
One of them is situational authority. The player has used concession as a situational authority. And that's okay. It's by the rules. They're allowed to do that. The other is outcome authority, using the dice as a constraint of a crisis that had arisen in play where we don't know whether it's going to happen or not. Do you see that a doomsmith would be causing himself and everybody at the table untold confusion if they try to resolve the situational authority with an outcome? That's extremely confusing.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah, and so
I think this is something where just naturally, when we play, this is one of those things. Oh, well, this is just how we do it,
right.
And it's like it's not in the text. It's like subconscious in how we manipulate everything.
Well, I agree, and if it's very functional for you guys, then bringing it to other people for them to try it is a wonderful, contribution.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go to sticking. Now we're getting into nuts and bolts of your game, right? What dice are for and
mm-hmm.
stuff. Do you now see how malversation fits right into this? Because malversation is the one time when the players have narration authority given the outcomes. Given whatever Havoc did, the player has narration authority. And it's a substantial narration authority, right? It's not just a sound effect.
Right.
Do you see why now you as a writer kept finding yourself like shying away? You got a whole section in there about like how malversation is like the most important thing to decide whether to have in or out of the game because it so drastically changes play.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's because that only makes sense if in every other circumstance of play, the Doomsmith has narration authority, which is okay if they do. But if they don't, if we just like traded off narration authority all the time at the table, like you do when playing Sorcerer, then you'd be looking at that malversation section saying, is that all? We do that shit all the time. So, therefore, let's go and look at malversation for a second and the way that you narrate outcomes all the time.
Okay.
I'm going to suggest that if the way the Doomsmith narrates outcomes and the way that the player narrates outcomes are pretty much the same anyway, then malversation's no big deal. Let's pretend for a second that almost all of your narrations are effectively just sound effects. You never do anything really important with outcomes. With narrations. The outcome is the outcome, and you basically narrate a sound effect and then say, what do we do next? Right? And that's your narrations as Doomsmith all the time. Let's say that's the case. That would mean that players, when they use malversation, would have the right to do more with it than you do. Because if they don't, then who cares? If all they ever get to do with malversation is give their own sound effect, so what?
Mm-hmm.
If you as Doomsmith always drive, real hard with your narrations, really take every outcome somewhere, then I get a little nervous. Because all that caution about malversation seems to be more like hesitancy about letting anyone else do it.
Mm-hmm.
So this relates to what we're talking about, because we're talking about narrations of outcomes, havoc outcomes in particular. Any outcome really, but havoc outcomes are a very, very good, important part of that. We're talking about narrations of them, which feed into upcoming situations, aren't we? Because those are the most significant narrations, are the ones that give us massive raw material for a new situation.
Well, the thing with malversation is that I guess it's actually not just narration, but it's also outcome control.
Right.
Because
it can't override the havoc, though.
Well, see, the thing is, normally when you roll havoc, you state consequences first. If you pass,
Right.
this happens. If you fail, this happens. Do you still want to do it? Well, what if this is the outcome? You can kind of bargain. Okay, that makes sense. Number, whatever. And then you roll, and then you just narrate it. That's, you're narrating what the dice roll. But with malversation, you don't state outcomes. You roll, and then if you pay the price, you state the outcome and the narration as the player after the roll.
Mm-hmm.
So you're like, I'm malversate. Okay, so what happens? Well, I burned the whole town down.
Right. No, I get that.
Moon explodes.
Right.
Yeah.
So now that I get that, but that's the important point of this. There's a couple of things to talk about. One is whether you're not draining your roll a little bit by all that pre-roll narration in the first place. But that's one thing. The other one is the caution about malversation. I'm claiming, and I think your point actually goes with it. Your caution about it is that it is a particular kind of authority granted that you don't get in any other way.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I'm claiming that concessions and paths should be treated with equal, not caution, but equal respect. That's the right word. Equal respect, because those are situational authority that the Doomsmith is saying, you know what, I'm not the situation nanny here. I'm not the situation den daddy. You guys wrote books, and you guys are involved in situation creation as much as I am.
Mm-hmm.
So here's your choice. Take a path, take a concession. Which is it? I'm good either way. Right. So the same thing applies to malversation. The Doomsmith says, for once, I'm not the den daddy of outcomes. And again, narrations, really, because when I say outcome, we're talking about success and fail, okay? We're talking about outcome of what you know.
Mm-hmm.
Narration has the opportunity to bring in more, right? Or an extent of how much it fails. The collateral damage, the particular details of it that may be quite substantial. Here, again, the Doomsmith says, because we're using malversation, I'm not your den daddy. You say what the details of this outcome are.